As soon as I stepped out of my car and took in the crisp mountain air, I felt like I'd made the perfect decision. This cabin, tucked deep in the snow-covered mountains, was exactly what I needed, an escape from the noise, the stress, and the constant buzzing of the world. No signal, no people, just me and the silence of nature. I planned on spending my days hiking through the thick woods, reading by the fire, and maybe even getting some journaling done. The solitude was supposed to be peaceful, but the moment I unlocked the door and walked inside, something felt off. The cabin was exactly as I expected, small, cozy, with a rustic charm. But there was a heaviness in the air, like the walls had been holding on to something. I shook it off, blaming it on being alone in such a remote place. The isolation was the whole point, right? Still, there was this nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach, an itch at the back of my neck like I was being watched. I couldn't explain it. After settling in, I stepped outside to get a lay of the land. The towering pines surrounded the cabin like sentinels, their branches weighed down by thick layers of snow. The wind hummed softly, carrying a faint whistle through the trees. Everything was still. Too still. I glanced over my shoulder, eyes scanning the tree line, half expecting to see something. But there was nothing. Just the snow and the silence. I told myself I was being paranoid. This was exactly what I came here for, to be alone. But that tension lingered, a quiet, unsettling presence just beyond my sight. The deeper the sun sank behind the mountains, the stronger it grew, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That first evening, after a long, exhausting hike through the thick snow and towering pines, I returned to the cabin ready to relax. As I dropped my gear by the door and glanced out the window, something stopped me cold. Footprints. Not animal tracks or the casual scatter of deer, these were human. And they weren't mine. The tracks led from the dense forest, cutting a direct path through the snow right up to my cabin door. For a moment, I just stared at them, my heart racing. I hadn't seen anyone since I arrived. No hikers, no rangers, no sign of life. And the snow was undisturbed when I'd left earlier. These footprints, they were fresh. Trying to stay calm, I told myself it could have been a ranger doing a check. But when I went to the door, I noticed something strange. The lock was still latched from the inside. No one had entered. A chill crawled up my spine, but I shook it off, locking the door behind me and telling myself I was overreacting. Maybe the snow was playing tricks on me. As night fell, the wind picked up, howling through the trees and shaking the cabin's old, wooden frame. I settled into bed, trying to ignore the creeping unease that had settled in my chest. But just as I was about to drift off, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic knocking. Tap. 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 It was coming from the walls. I shot up, heart pounding, listening. The wind roared outside, but beneath it, that tapping persisted, steady and deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight and swept it across the room, every shadow looking more sinister in the beam of light. Nothing. I checked outside, too, but the snow was untouched, the footprints from earlier already half buried in fresh powder. I shut the door, locking it tight. But as I crawled back into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. And that tapping, it didn't stop. The next morning, I woke to the sound of wind hammering against the cabin. I peered outside and saw a heavy snowstorm raging. My plans for another hike were crushed, the snow was coming down hard, blanketing everything in a thick, suffocating white. I tried to make the best of it, telling myself it was just a day of relaxation. A fire, a book, maybe even some journaling. But deep down, I felt uneasy. The memory of those footprints, that tapping, it hadn't left me. As I was making coffee, I glanced out the window, and my heart nearly stopped. Through the swirling snow, I saw someone. An old man, bundled up in ragged layers of clothing, trudging through the snow directly toward the cabin. His movements were slow, deliberate, and despite the storm, he seemed to know exactly where he was going. I froze, watching as he came closer. He didn't knock. Instead, he just stood there, his face barely visible beneath his hood, waving me over. My gut screamed at me not to open the door, but curiosity, or maybe fear, got the better of me. I cracked the door just enough to let the freezing air blast in. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. He leaned in, his breath fogging the air between us, and in a gravelly, broken voice, he muttered, "You shouldn't have come here." His eyes, they were wide, hollow, filled with something that made my skin crawl, fear. Real, bone-deep fear. I tried to ask him what he meant, but he cut me off, his voice rising in desperation. "You have to leave. Before nightfall. They come out after dark, the mountain spirits. They don't like outsiders." A cold dread settled over me, but before I could ask him anything else, he turned abruptly and hurried back into the storm, his figure vanishing into the swirling white. I stood there, staring after him, heart racing, unsure of what to do. Spirits? Was this some kind of local legend? A warning to scare off tourists? I didn't know. But something in the way he spoke, in the look in his eyes, made me believe that whatever it wasn't just a story. With the storm raging on and no way to leave, I had no choice but to stay in the cabin, though the old man's words echoed in my mind. They come out after dark. I couldn't shake the chill that ran through me every time I thought about it. Needing to keep busy, I began exploring the cabin more closely, anything to distract myself from the creeping unease. That's when I found something odd, a loose floorboard near the hearth. Curiosity got the better of me. I pried it up and found a stash of old books and yellowed newspapers, brittle from age. They seemed out of place, forgotten here, much like this cabin itself. I dusted them off and began reading, hoping to find some explanation, maybe even a clue about the old man. The stories I found weren't comforting. They were local legends, chilling accounts of people who had disappeared in these very mountains, their bodies never found. One headline from the 1970s caught my eye, "Mysterious Disappearances, Another Hiker Lost in the Range." The article spoke of cabins, just like this one, where travelers were last seen, only to vanish without a trace. Each story had the same eerie detail. Witnesses had reported seeing shadowy figures in the snow, always at night, always near these remote, isolated cabins. One particular article stood out, "The Lost Souls of the Mountain." It talked about people who had gone missing decades ago, during brutal winters just like this one. Their bodies had never been recovered, but locals swore they still wandered the mountains, trapped, searching for something, or someone. The more I read, the colder the air seemed to grow, even with the fire burning. As night began to fall, that feeling of being watched intensified. It was as if the storm itself was alive, its winds howling around the cabin, battering the walls like an angry, unseen force. And then, I began to hear them, faint whispers carried on the wind, drifting through the cracks in the cabin walls. The voices were soft at first, barely audible over the storm, but they grew louder, closer. It was impossible to make out what they were saying, but it wasn't a friendly sound. It was a warning. Or maybe, a threat. I shut the book, my heart pounding. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something was out there, just beyond the snow, just waiting for night to fall. The storm was relentless, pounding against the cabin with a fury that seemed unnatural, like the mountain itself was trying to trap me here. I had made up my mind. I was leaving at first light, no matter what. My nerves were shot, my breath shaky, and every creak of the old wood made my heart race. I packed my gear, trying to calm the rising panic, but something about the air felt wrong. It was thicker, heavier, like it was pressing down on me, squeezing my chest tight. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate crunching in the snow, right outside the cabin. My blood ran cold. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I pulled back the curtain just a crack and froze. There was a figure standing just beyond the window, barely visible through the swirling snow, its shape shadowy, wrong. But its eyes, God, those eyes, were glowing, reflecting the dim light from the cabin, staring straight into me. They weren't human. They couldn't be. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps stopped, But then, the knocking started again. Louder this time. It wasn't just coming from one spot, it was all around me, echoing from every wall at once. Like whatever it was outside, it wasn't alone. The lights flickered, the fire sputtered, and the temperature plummeted. I could see my breath hanging in the air, and the whispers were deafening now, swirling around me, too many voices at once, too many to understand. I turned back to the window, and the figure had moved closer. Its face, twisted, blurred, like it was shifting under the snow. I couldn't make out any features, but it was staring at me, pressing its hand against the glass. The window began to crack, spiderwebbing beneath its touch. I panicked. I grabbed the fire poker from the hearth and smashed the back window, throwing myself into the snow. The cold hit me like a wall, but I didn't care. I had to get out. I ran, the wind whipping against my face, the snow blinding me, but I could hear them, the footsteps behind me. They were getting closer, faster, crunching through the snow like they were right on my heels. The whispers followed, louder now, hissing through the wind, circling me, laughing, mocking. I didn't dare look back, I couldn't. My legs burned, my chest ached, but I kept running, down the mountain, away from that cursed cabin, away from whatever was chasing me. Just as I thought I was far enough, I heard it, a voice, barely audible over the howling wind, but unmistakable. It came from the direction of the cabin, distant but clear, and it chilled me to my core. You can't escape the mountain. And I knew, no matter how far I ran, the mountain, it wouldn't let me go.